Get back into books with Richard and Judy.
Now, we're bringing you something a bit different and rather poignant in this edition of our book club.
We're talking about Sean Busby. She just about managed to finish her book, A Commonplace Killing, before she died from lung cancer in 2012.
It's a great period piece, a very accurate period piece set in post-war London, with the murder of a woman at the centre of the plot.
And joining us to talk about the book and the writer is Sean's husband, the BBC's economics editor, Robert Peston.
The Richard and Judy Book Club, telling the story behind the cover.
And we're here today to talk about a wonderful thriller, A Commonplace Killing by Sean Busby. Now, Sean is no longer with us. She was taken by lung cancer. And she finished this extraordinary story just a couple of weeks before she died. And her husband is Robert Peston. Hello to you. You kind of devoted quite a large space of your time in getting the final draft of this book together, because you didn't even know that she'd completed it, did you?
Well, I had sort of a hunch that it was almost there, but no, I didn't know that it was finished to the extent that it was. What happened was that Sean was we were told, on a Friday, right at the beginning of August of 2012, by our doctor, our consultant oncologist, that there was nothing more they could do to stave off the growth of spread of Sean's cancer. She had lung. She was a non-smoker, but she had been diagnosed with lung cancer.
Was it in the family? Was it a hereditary issue?
No, there was no hereditary element in all of this. As it happens, a terrifying number of people get lung cancer. I mean, it's the biggest cancer killer in this country by far.
I was telling you earlier, my mother's dying of it as well. So.
And somewhere between 10 and 20% of those people who contract lung cancer and die, there's no association with smoking at all. No. And there's a bit of a... there's a bit of ignorance around the place about this, because people assume that it's only connected to smoking. Anyway, but by the way, and actually the other thing is, we had a great life together over the 5 years since she was diagnosed, punctuated by sort of awful treatment of various sorts, but she was amazingly brave, and we just sort of got on with it. But there was this just horrible moment when they said there was nothing more they could do. And I suppose, as a sort of testament to what an extraordinary person she was, one of the things she did after being given this death sentence was, we were down in our tiny little place in Wales overlooking the sea, and she sat on the sofa, took out a notebook. I sat next to her and spent the day just writing.
Finishing it.
And she was writing the book. And she closed it at the end of the day, put it to one side, and we decided that we wanted to make these last weeks as nice as possible, and, I parked it. She didn't have much, we didn't know how long she had, but she didn't have much time left after that, a couple of weeks. And a week after she died, I took out the notebook, partly because, as I actually say in the introduction to the book, it was like having another conversation with her. It was like her still being with me, because these were going to be new words, by my darling wife, and read them, realised that she had, to all intents and purposes, finished the book. There were one or two things that were slightly unclear. I had to make judgments about, the order of paragraphs, or whether certain things were definitely meant to be included. But, basically, in her inimitably clear and moving style, she'd finished it.
And you transcribed.
And I typed it up, and it was a very hard thing to do.
Yes.
I think I sort of cried more or less throughout, as it were. What is quite interesting, because she was an unbelievably, fastidious writer, even when she was simply writing the draft by a longhand. So I noticed afterwards that when I looked at my typed up notes, there were one or two spelling mistakes and grammatical errors in it, and I thought, maybe they're in her notes, and actually her notes were completely perfect. It was me who introduced the mistakes.
That's funny.
That adds another interesting light on Sean and also on the book, because the book is set immediately after the Second World War, and in a London which has been devastated, obviously, and where there's still terrible rationing, and it's not a nice place to live. The thing is, it reads. It's a thriller. It is about a killing, but nevertheless, it reads terribly accurately. And Sean actually also was. She was not just a novelist; she was a historian, wasn't she?
That's exactly right. And she always immersed herself. Always immersed herself in her subject matter before writing. Mm-hmm. This was based on a real incident, this book. It was an incident that her grandparents, whom she adored, had told her about when she was a child. And at any particular moment, she always had, 3 or 4 different ideas for a book going around her in her head, and she would, try them all out. And at a particular moment, 2 or 3 years ago, she decided to look a bit more into this story that her grandparents had told her about.
Perhaps I can just quickly give a sort of thumbnail sketch of it. It's basically some children playing in the rubble in the bombed-out wreckage of a street, see a woman's leg sticking out from under the rubble, and at first they think it's probably a shop mannequin, but it's not. It's a body of a woman. And we go on the journey then to find out who she was, why she was killed, the unusual nature of the killing. At first the police think it's just a casual sex crime, and they dread those because they're so hard to nail down. But there's much, much more to it than that, and that's the story. But I have to echo what Judy said. Her evocation of the atmosphere of immediate post-war London, and I'm very interested in the Second World War, I read a lot about it, is beautifully drawn. It really is. I mean, you can almost taste the dust in your mouth, and the weakness of the tea, and these great vistas of nothing, where the bombing had just devastated street after street after street. It's all written about, and one could almost be there.
That neglected triangle where the Camden, Holloway and Caledonian roads intersect, long oppressed by soot and the continuous rumble of the railway, its bounds set by the gloomy bulk of the women's prison and the desolation of the empty livestock market, had been done for long before the Hitler War blasted every last vestige of respectability to smithereens. From the tops of buses you could see how in other parts of town the bomb sites had been transformed by clumps of fireweed, willow herb and ragwort. But in Holloway only fireplaces and door frames, like overturned tombstones, protruded from rubble patches scattered with the broken bones of chimney pots. Within a few minutes' walk you might find yourself passing Pentonville on Hanging Day or the Crippen Murder House. But for the most part, Holloway languished in obscurity, a meagre landscape of peeling stucco and thwarted ambition unrolling in street after nondescript street of villas, built in more aspirant times and gradually declined into bed-sitting rooms inhabited by prostitutes, Irish navvies, coloureds, army deserters. And then came the V-weapons, almost putting the whole lot out of its misery.
You say that she researched it. I mean, in what way? Did she go to libraries, or did she fall back on our old friend Google? I mean, what was her modus operandi? Because it's beautifully drawn.
Well, she was a very assiduous researcher, so, she always, with her books, went over to, the British Library's, newspaper archive at Colindale, and spent vast amounts of time there reading through contemporaneous newspapers. She read loads of books written at the time. She interviewed people who were alive then.
Did she actually find the case that it was based on?
Yeah, she found the original case, and she changed it. Let's be, to be absolutely clear about this, because she didn't know whether there might be, living family connected to the original case, and she didn't want to upset anybody.
No.
The actual details of the case that her grandparents told her about, she completely changed. So the location of the case and all the circumstances around it. Yeah. But so the original case was, in a sense, what you might call a trigger for her imagination. Yeah. So but I suppose what I'm driving at here is one of the reasons this book, I think, reads so authentically is because there was a random killing of a woman on a bomb site in Holloway in 1946. Although, as I say, who that woman was and how she was killed, she changed all of that.
Well, in the book, the character Lillian, this is another thing I loved about it, because we meet Lillian before we discover the body, if you like, and we meet her in her normal suburban life. And I loved her, and I loved the way she was drawn. Sean was very good, wasn't she, at getting into a women's character. You could tell she was very empathetic with women.
I think she was very empathetic with women. I think she was empathetic in general, though, because I find Cooper a completely believable and compelling character. And so, I just always felt with Sean that she was brilliant at understanding people. Now, there's a slight paradox here, which is that Sean always said to me that this was something that was not remotely instinctive. She hated going to parties because she was one of those people who said that she just always found it completely impossible to pick up on those sorts of signals that people give out in the way that they behave or the intonations of what they say. And therefore she, in a sense, made a study of people, as it were. And I think, so although, there's nothing laboured in her characterisation, part of her life's work was, I think, trying to sort of understand people. And so I think that is one of the some of us who might have a more instinctive grasp of what makes people tick probably wouldn't be able to write about them with quite the same compelling way.
Well, it's what a good historian does, isn't it? I mean, they study the time, they study the people, and they reinterpret the motives, if you like, and the personality for the rest of us. I think it's a smashing book. I loved it very much. I'm terribly sorry about the circumstances, but it's obviously been a real labour of love for you to transcribe and
it's paid off. It's terrific.
Oh yeah, I mean, one is terribly torn about all this, because on the one hand, it's great for me that lots and lots of people are now reading this book and seeing what a brilliant writer she was. Her other books are also fantastic. Naturally, for me, there's also a terrible sadness that she's not here to enjoy it herself. We always had this joke that one day, I'd be able to retire because, she would write the great bestseller. And she said that's complete nonsense because, I don't write for those reasons. I write because I like writing.
Yeah, you can
and that's what motivated. She just loved the creative process. And she was also, she was an accomplished art, she puts me to shame. She was, she did brilliant, she was an accomplished visual artist as well. She was a dancer. She did, dramatic things. She was an extraordinary, polymath, all-round, powerful person. But the other thing which is just extraordinary about her is, unlike sort of, people with egos like me, she did everything she did because she loved it, not remotely because anybody might think she was any good.
Absolutely. Well, it's a remarkable story. It's a really, really good read. And as you mentioned there, it makes me want to read all her other stuff, her back catalogue, which I intend to do in 2014.
That'd be brilliant if you did.
Lovely to see you.
Really good to see you.
Cheers, Robert.
Sean Busby combined a vivid imagination with extraordinary research abilities. She was a historian, and pretty much all her books started with a real event, and she would immerse herself in a period. So Her previous book, Macnaghten, was about the early to middle 19th century. This book is set in 1946. And her initial approach was to read all the newspapers of the time, read contemporary books. In this case, she would even try and interview the odd person who would have been alive and living in the area at the time. She was able, I think, to make these past worlds really come to life. But then, of course, there was the important job of coming up with a story which people wanted to, or want to read from beginning to end. And again, she had, I think, a very, very strong storytelling ability. Writing was something that was a passion. It wasn't just a job at all. It was something she really did for enjoyment. And so right from the beginning, she would talk about ideas with me for particular books, moan if the publisher didn't like a particular idea, and be excited when the publisher did. She was incredibly diligent and organised. She would go off to she had a little study overlooking the garden, and she would just go off there and devote set periods of time to writing. But she was also somebody who was thinking about her work all the time. She took a notebook around with her, and if she suddenly had an idea for how to develop a story, she would take it out. We might be out for a meal or something, and she would just take it out and scribble down, the latest idea in that sense. The boys and I were very, very clear that if we could get this book published, that we would. Sean didn't tell us that it was basically finished, and so until I opened the notes, I just didn't know that. But once I'd read them and typed them up, it was perfectly clear that this was not only a finished book, but a fantastic book.
What you might call, I suppose, as far as Robert Peston's concerned, a labour of love, really.
Definitely.
Doing something to honour, his marriage, his wife, and done with such affection and attention to detail. He really has.
Yeah, and I really, really admire the way he talks about it and the way he admits how he cried all the time as he was transcribing the last third of her book after she died, not even realising she'd written that and that she'd finished the book. But he felt it was his duty to do it, and how he loved hearing her voice again, hearing her words again, but nevertheless wept all the way through. And I think it's very strong of him to take this on, because it's only just over a year, 18 months ago that she died. And to take all that on, the writing the foreword, taking on the publicity. He's obviously very committed that the book should be successful because he loved her so much and he's so proud of her.
I agree with you, but I think it's almost automatic, isn't it? I mean, if the terrible thing were to happen to one of us like that, I just finished a book or you just finished a book and then we passed away, I think the other would want to get it out there, wouldn't we?
But it's still emotionally very harrowing.
Oh, it is,
and
extremely.
I think he talks about that very well. It's a good book, too.
Well,
it's a really good book.
As we explored in the interview, and we must say this to people listening to this now, the sense of period is beautifully drawn. I mean, perfectly drawn. You can also smell the carbon in the air from the bombings. I remember there are a couple of Ealing film comedies that were shot in the late 1940s. And it's quite a shock to see them now, because in the middle of these sort of comedy larks, you get these vistas of London, which was basically eviscerated, shattered, There were these huge landscapes of nothing but rubble, for like a mile. You'd have street after street after street just flattened. Tremendous horizons, and she writes about that very, very well. She writes about an exhausted city. Yes, we'd won the war, but people felt that we'd almost lost it because we were eating worse food than the Germans were eating. And
from a woman's point of view, she writes amazingly well about the rationing. The central character, if you like, is a suburban housewife. And she daily has to take on this enormous task of shopping
and queuing,
and the queues for a loaf of bread, and how exhausting and depressing it all is.
Well, it's interesting that actually not many people know this. That she makes it clear in the story. rationing got worse after the war. Bread went on points. Throughout the war, bread was never rationed. You could get as much bread as you wanted. But after the war was over, things were so bad in this country that bread was rationed, the staff of life. But then there's, of course, the whole other story, this police investigation into the killing, the fact that initially the police don't want really to get too involved in it because they think it's just a random sex crime and they're impossible to nail down. But bit by bit, it is a murder and they have to take it seriously, and bit by bit, this world-weary cop who's gone through the war, solving crimes which increasingly are linked to the deprivation caused by the bombing and by rationing and all the rest of it, he begins to suspect that this is not what he originally thought it was. This is not just an ordinary sex crime. This is something much deeper. And I love that. I love that gradual dawning of the realisation that he was onto something much more important. And I think that, considering that Sian completed this book 2 weeks before she died of lung cancer, the writing right up to the end is pin sharp. I mean, really, really good. She was just a natural. And, well, it's obvious from talking to Robert that he misses her very much.
Get to know the authors by getting your copy of their work from WHSmith. There's added content at the back of the book exclusively with Richard and Judy.
I've sequenced the questions for maximum speed of elimination, I explained. I believe I can eliminate most women in less than 40 seconds.
Richard and Judy, exclusive to WHSmith.
Get the books online or in store from WHSmith for lots of exclusive bonus content. Or, if you have an e-reader, download the e-books today from WHSmith or on the free Kobo app.